We're back for a discussion of early Renaissance architecture. In this video, we're going to discuss a few examples of early Renaissance architecture in Italy. We're going to look primarily at the dome of the Florence Cathedral. We will also look at Brunelleschi's Ospedale degli Innocenti, the Hospital of the Innocents. It's a sort of hospital for orphans. And we will also look at Alberti's Sant'Andrea, which is a church in Mantova. And these will help us get an idea of the main components of Renaissance architecture. I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and I'm an art historian, and this is Art Trippin Lecture Series. Hi, I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and this is Art Trippin. What do we see when we see especially early Renaissance architecture? We see a lot of classical influence. And what does that mean when we say classical influence? That means we will see these architects looking back to ancient Roman and Greek architecture for inspiration. So, for example, when we look at the dome of the Florence Cathedral, this is designed by Brunelleschi. Brunelleschi is also credited with sort of codifying linear perspective and helping Masaccio to figure out how to paint the Holy Trinity and how to do all of that linear perspective. Brunelleschi's dome of the Florence Cathedral is a really dramatic, huge dome, one of the biggest domes in Europe at the time, and it was the largest dome that had been built in Italy since ancient times. So the next largest dome is the Pantheon in Rome, which was like over 1,000 years before Brunelleschi's dome of the Florence Cathedral. Italian Renaissance architecture is seen as a very intellectual style rather than an emotional style. So Gothic architecture, like the Chartres Cathedral, is considered a more emotional style. And in contrast, Renaissance architecture is seeking balance, is seeking symmetry. And we see this in Brunelleschi's dome, which is also a great feat of engineering. In fact, Brunelleschi had to invent a machine to hoist the bricks up to build the dome. So not only did he come up with this really ingenious design for the dome after traveling to Rome and studying the writings of Vitruvius, and Vitruvius wrote about Roman architecture. So he studied Roman architecture and he studied the Roman Pantheon, and then he brought these ideas back to Florence, then created this flying buttress type construction that would allow them to build this dome. Flying buttresses were used in the Gothic era, but these are not seen as the ideal style choice in the Renaissance. The Italians in the Renaissance are looking for a much more simple, much more clean aesthetic compared to a French Gothic cathedral, for example. So Brunelleschi has to figure out how to construct this massive dome safely and efficiently. So he invents this hoisting machine that hoists the stones up to the top of this church that has, by the way, sat without a dome, without a ceiling or a roof for many, many years. So he sort of creates an inner dome structure that almost works like a scaffolding that they can use to then create the outer dome. So it really was a feat of engineering at the time. So Brunelleschi's dome is, like I said, an amazing feat of engineering, of mathematics, of technology, and of course the design harkens back to the ancient Roman design in terms of the monumentality and the simplicity of the aesthetic. We will see Brunelleschi looking back at ancient Roman architecture in his Ospedale degli Innocenti, the Hospital of the Innocents. This is a sort of care home for orphans, basically. But we see in his design these rounded arches. You see on the second story above the windows these triangular pediments that looks exactly like a Greek cathedral or the facade of the Roman Pantheon. And the arches sort of replicate the style of a Roman triumphal arch. You also see the use of columns, and you'll also see, specifically at this site, in these little lunettes in between the columns, are these little sort of children and toddlers and babies wrapped in bandages. So this speaks to the purpose of the Ospedale dei Innocenti. You will also see that the proportions are all balanced. I mentioned in another video that both in the classical world and in the Renaissance, architects and artists were interested in balance and symmetry. So did you know that in Renaissance Italy, instead of we in the United States use the unit of measurement of the foot, in Renaissance Italy, they used the braccia. Your braccia is your arm or your forearm. So they would measure, for example, a pillar might be 12 braccia or 12 arms tall, and we would maybe call that 12 feet tall. And so what kind of symmetry do we see? We would see, for example, that the space between the two columns would be equal to the height of the column, so that this created a very harmonious, balanced, symmetrical look. And this was the goal in Renaissance architecture. We can also see something similar if we look at the Church of Santo Spirito, also designed by Brunelleschi, also in Florence. If you look at the interior of Santo Spirito and you compare it to, say, the interior of a Gothic church in Florence, like Santa Croce, you can really see the difference in style. In a Gothic cathedral or in a church like Santa Croce, you can see pointed arches, you can see stained glass windows, you can see a lot of decorative elements. This is very typical of Gothic or medieval style architecture. If we look at the interior of Santo Spirito, we see the Roman influence. We see a coffered ceiling that might remind us of the ceiling of the Pantheon in Rome. And then we see rounded arches, which again remind us of Roman architecture. And you will also see a kind of pared down, more simple interior aesthetic. So Roman architecture is known for its monumentality and sometimes its severity and its simplicity. And that's what you see in early Italian Renaissance architecture, an interest in simplifying the Gothic style, which was seen as too gaudy, too ornate, too fanciful. This Renaissance style was seen as more calming in its simplicity, that in the same way that sort of God is organizing the world, architecture can be used to organize our physical spaces here on Earth. The last image that I want to show you in this introduction to early Renaissance architecture is Alberti's Sant'Andrea in the modern day town of Mantova. Mantova was a really important city in the Renaissance. It's a bit of a smaller town nowadays in Italy, but I highly recommend a visit if you ever make it to Italy, because you have this really exemplary work of early Renaissance architecture at Sant'Andrea. So the exterior of this church, especially the facade, shows you this very typical early Renaissance style. We have a triangular pediment and rounded arches that replicate the kind of things we see in Roman architecture. You've got barrel vaulting, you've got classical columns, in this case engaged columns, and you also see a tripartite facade. So there's a central arch, and then there are these sort of secondary arches that the facade is divided into three sections, referencing the Trinity. You see, they love triangular compositions. They love the use of three in the Italian Renaissance because of these kind of holy connotations to the Trinity. And you see a very symmetrical design. You can draw a line right down the center, and the two sides of the facade are almost mirrored to each other. So it's very symmetrical, balanced, and orderly design, which is desirable by 1470 in Italy and is really in contrast to the drama and the ornateness of the Gothic cathedral that you might find, for example, in France. We can see this throughout early Renaissance architecture in Italy. Just look no further than the Medici Palace in Florence. where we see again the repetition of the rounded arch, the use of classical orders of the columns. This very balanced style is the ideal in the early Renaissance in Italy. Hope you enjoyed the video. Like and subscribe. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments, and stay tuned for the next video when we talk about the High Renaissance in Italy.